Forget the myths of the countless wild hordes. In reality, the Mongols were almost always outnumbered by their enemies. Genghis Khan's secret lay neither in fury nor in sheer mass, but in the flawless architecture of power he forged in the steppe. How did illiterate nomads create a command machine capable of instantly transmitting one man's will to 100,000 warriors without delay or distortion? While the knights of Europe drowned in a chaos of personal ambition, tangled orders, and noble recklessness, the Mongols transformed their army into a single steel organism. Today, we dissect the decimal matrix, a system that was 700 years ahead of its time and became the foundation for every modern army in existence. Before we dissect the matrix itself, we must understand the hidden mechanism that made it work. There was a single detail that turned ordinary discipline into a law of steel. It wasn't just loyalty, it was a calculation that made betrayal or flight physically meaningless. We will reveal how the Mongols made cowardice technically impossible in the finale. For now, look at a 13th century battlefield through the eyes of a commander. Before you is the chaos commonly called an army. In Europe or China, a force was a heap of disconnected links. A king gave an order to a duke, who gave it to a baron, who gave it to his knights. The problem was that this chain relied on personal ego and words of honor. As soon as the numbers exceeded 5,000 swords, command collapsed. 5,000 is the limit of physical sight and hearing. In the heat of battle, when dust chokes the horizon and screams drown out the drums, a commander's order simply dissolved. A feudal army became a blind giant. The head is still shouting, but the limbs are acting on their own. Knights sought personal glory, charging without orders, while infantry, losing sight of their lord's banner, simply scattered. This was the ceiling of efficiency for the entire world. Genghis Khan approached this as an architect. He realized that to lead 100,000 men, he had to stop seeing warriors as individuals. They had to be turned into standardized blocks, stripped of names and tribal ties. He performed a total reassembly of the steppe. Tribes that had feuded for centuries were forcibly mixed and driven into a rigid decimal grid. Now, a warrior's lineage didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was part of his 10. This created a system where the commander's will was transmitted down the chain without distortion, like a steel cable. It was this architecture that later allowed Subutai to coordinate corps hundreds of kilometers apart. We detailed this master of operational art in our 4th episode. The Mongols created an army that didn't lose its head even if it was severed, because every block knew exactly what to do if the link above it failed. The Mongol decimal system was not merely a way of counting. It was a rigid engineering standard that turned the army into a modular construct. Genghis Khan divided his machine into 4 primary levels: Arban, Jagun, Mingan, and Tumen. Each level operated under a single protocol. The foundation of the entire structure was the Arban, the 10. This was the system's atom. Unlike European militias, where warriors might not even know the names of their neighbors in line, a Mongol 10 was a family. They lived, ate, and trained together for decades. There were no redundant people in this block. Everyone knew their role. If one fell, the other 9 automatically realigned to close the gap. It was a perfect balance. 10 men is the maximum that can be controlled by voice and gesture in the thickest fog of war. The next level was the Jagun, the 100. This was a combat module capable of independent maneuvers. 10 Arbans joined under a centurion. Here, the mathematics of command took over. The centurion didn't need to watch 100 men. He only needed to control 10, his squad leaders. The speed of command here was several times higher than in any other army. While a knightly host struggled to deploy, a Mongol hundred was already executing a maneuver because the signal traveled the shortest path. Then came the Mingan, the 1,000. This was the primary tactical unit. And finally, the Tumen, 10,000 sabers. A Tumen was an autonomous mechanism capable of conquering entire states. Why exactly the number 10? It is the branching factor. Try to keep tasks for 12 or 15 objects in your focus simultaneously. You will see your attention begin to crumble. 10 is the limit where control remains absolute and reaction speed stays instantaneous. This was the core of their superiority. When a Tumen Bashi issued an order, he did not address 10,000 riders. He gave the command to 10 Mingan Bashis. They, in turn, passed it to their centurions. The order rippled through the entire mass of troops like a seismic wave, losing no clarity. This structure allowed the army to be both monolithic and incredibly flexible. To keep this mechanism from stalling over vast distances, the Mongols required a high-speed data transmission system between Tumens. We detailed how they solved this using the Yam stations and Paisa in the 5th episode of our series. It was the combination of decimal hierarchy and high-speed couriers that made the Mongol machine unstoppable. In the classical warfare of that era, the death of a commander almost always signaled the end of the battle. If the king's banner fell, the army turned into an uncontrollable mob and fled. This was a critical vulnerability. The entire structure rested on a single pillar. The Mongols, however, created a system with the properties of living tissue. If you cut out one section, neighboring cells immediately assume its functions. In the decimal matrix, a commander was not just a leader, he was a functional link. Within every 10, 100, or 1,000, there was a rigid, predefined order of succession. If a decimal commander fell, the next warrior in rank instantly took his place. No pauses, no arguments, no shadow of doubt. Power in this system behaved like a fluid. If one vessel broke, the contents flowed into another, maintaining the overall pressure. Imagine it as the architecture of a cathedral, where the load is held not by solitary columns, but by a system of interlocking arches and buttresses. If one support is knocked out, the weight redistributes to the others. It was this structural redundancy that allowed the Mongols to remain combat effective in situations that would have buried any other army. This discipline and the unbreakable nature of the command skeleton allowed the Mongols to pull off their most dangerous maneuvers. For instance, the famous feigned retreat we discussed in our 2nd episode. Simulating a panicked flight with thousands of horsemen without turning it into a real rout is an almost impossible task. But because every link in the system knew who would receive the flow of power in case of losses, the formation remained controllable even in simulated chaos. The Mongol army had no pressure points whose destruction could paralyze the entire organism. The death of a general or even the Khan himself did not stop the machine. Commands continued to circulate through the living links as long as a single intact unit remained. This was a victory of engineering calculation over human fragility. It is crucial to understand the decimal division was not Genghis Khan's invention. It was the ancient skeleton of the steppe used by armies since the time of the Xiongnu and ancient Persia. But before Temujin, this structure was a mere formality. A 10 was simply a family, and 1,000 a tribe. The army remained a hostage to blood ties. If a clan chief decided to leave, he took the entire link with him, collapsing the formation. Genghis Khan executed what can be called the Great Meltdown. He tore open old tribal seams and mixed warring nomads within a single cell. Your family was no longer those bound to you by blood, but those standing shoulder to shoulder with you in rank. This was a radical transition from an army of clans to an army of functions. Names were erased, emblems forgotten. Only the link and its task remained. To appreciate the genius of this solution, compare the Mongol matrix to the legendary Roman legion. A legion is a bespoke creation, a complex mosaic of different troop types, hastati, principes, triarii, and highly specialized officers. It is a delicate mechanism, incredibly difficult to assemble, and even harder to replenish after heavy losses. If the veterans are wiped out, the legion loses its essence. The Mongol system is cast concrete. Here, every link is identical to the next. In this structure, there are no irreplaceable parts because the very form of the unit is standardized. If 110 perishes, another takes its place, identical in strength and training. A commander here ceased to be an elder by birthright. He became a functional component, appointed solely for his effectiveness. This open architecture allowed the Mongols to instantly absorb foreign expertise. When they required siege masters or ballistics experts, they integrated them into their mechanism as new specialized links. We discussed how this simplicity allowed yesterday's riders to operate complex catapults and gunpowder charges in our Engineers of the Steppe episode. The Mongols created a structure that could not be broken by destroying its elite. They turned the army into an infinite resource, where every man was not a unique craftsman, but a reliable element of a single steel monolith. A management matrix is useless if the order attenuates in the dust of battle. Genghis Khan solved the problem of command transmission not as a mystic, but as a physicist, utilizing the maximum available amplitudes. When thousands of hooves kick up tons of sand, a commander's voice is powerless. Optics and acoustics take the stage. The first solution, extreme visual contrast. The Mongols used a signal flag system of only two colors, black and white. From an optical engineering standpoint, these are the extreme values of the spectrum. In conditions of visual noise, where the sun blinds and dust erases the horizon, the human eye instantly detects the shift between these two markers. A sharp flash of white against the black banner, and the Tumen begins its wheel. The second, acoustic resonance. Massive Nakara kettle drums carried on camels operated on ultra-low frequencies. This sound didn't need to be heard by ears. It wasn't drowned out by the clashing of steel or screams. The rhythm of the Nakara was felt by the entire body, vibrating through armor and flesh. It was a low-frequency resonance that set the pace of the advance and synchronized the army's pulse, turning it into a single pendulum. For precise target designation, they used ballistic markers, whistling arrows. This wasn't just a psychological tool. Every 10-man unit heard the attack vector. A warrior didn't need to visually scan for the target. The sound of the arrow released by the commander dictated the direction. As soon as the distinct whistle pierced the air, hundreds of riders instantly adjusted their front along the sound's vector. In such a system, an order moved like a shock wave through a solid body. Each warrior didn't need to see the Khan or hear his voice. He only needed to synchronize with his immediate commander. The signal echoed from one link to the next, losing almost none of its energy. This provided the Mongol machine with a response speed unmatched by any army in the world for centuries.
We now arrive at the hidden mechanism that made the Mongol matrix not just manageable, but monolithic. Genghis Khan's Great Yasa was not merely a moral code, it was an engineering tension system where every link was clamped by its neighbors. Here we close the primary loop. How did the Mongols make cowardice and betrayal technically pointless? The secret we posed in the very first block was the principle of collective responsibility. It was brutal and mathematically precise. If one warrior from a 10 fled in battle, the entire 10 was executed. If a 10 fled, the entire 100 was executed. Following the Great Meltdown, where Genghis Khan mixed the tribes, your neighbors in the unit were people you had shared food and shelter with for years. The death of all for the failure of one turned the group into a single nerve center. This wasn't wild cruelty, it was psychology forged into a safety catch. Imagine it as a chain in a heavy lifting hoist. In an ordinary army, a weak link simply snaps, and the entire load crashes onto the others. In the Mongol system, every link was forged to its neighbors by a law of death. Fear of the enemy is a variable, it can vanish in the heat of an attack. But fear of the Yasa was a constant. It created an internal pressure that prevented the formation from flowing in reverse. Cowardice in such an architecture became mathematically unprofitable. A deserter had no chance of survival. Behind him remained 9 men whose death warrants he had just signed. They became his executioners before he could even leave the battlefield. It was a mechanical stop, blocking the very possibility of panic. This mutual control system turned the army into a living, cast block. Where a knightly host would shatter after the first failure, the Mongol matrix only compressed tighter under external pressure. It was the triumph of systemic terror over individual bravery. We have the answer to the mystery from the first block. The Mongols won not because they did not fear death, but because the architecture of their formation made flight more dangerous than the most hopeless battle. Genghis Khan's empire has long since vanished from the maps, but his decimal matrix remains. It has seeped into the very DNA of modern warfare. Look closely at the structure of any regular army today. Squad, platoon, company, battalion. These are the same tens, hundreds, and thousands, merely under different names. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer half the world, he left humanity a universal blueprint for managing violence that has remained unsurpassed for 800 years. The primary lesson of this system is brutal. Mechanics always defeat mastery. The European knight was an artist of war, a unique craftsman whose style was honed over decades. But art cannot be scaled. You cannot quickly replace a fallen master swordsman. The Mongol system, however, was pure technology. It allowed yesterday's shepherds to be transformed into functional links of a steel monolith in a matter of weeks. This was the final verdict of that era. A disciplined system always triumphs over brilliant individualism. The matrix doesn't need heroes, it needs reliable elements that do not break under load and transmit signals with precision. The Mongols proved that war is not a contest of valor, but a competition in structural integrity and the speed of command transmission. You have been watching War Mechanics. Here, we don't just retell history, we dissect it to understand how the gears of the world's greatest military machines operate. Analytics are more important than dates, and understanding principles is more vital than dry facts. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments which other military system, past or present, do you want us to strip down to the very last bolt.